Okay, thank you. Greetings. Dokuz Eylül University Philosophy Department welcomes you all to the 17th of the series called Philosophy Today and Tomorrow. While organizing this event, which started in 2011, our main goal was to draw attention to the importance of the master-pupil relationship and to follow the philosophical dialogue between the teachers and their students. This is the first time we are holding this event at an international level, as it has only been held nationally previously. Another pleasing renewal for us is to be holding this event in partnership with the newly established Turkey Kant Society. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to the organization and publishing of this event. I also would like to express my immense gratitude to Sorin Baiasu and Sebastian Orlander for participating in our event and supporting us. Saniye Vatansever'in, who is also a member of Turkey Kant Society from the Philosophy Department of Bilkent University, will be moderating our event today. I would like to leave the floor to Saniye to introduce Sorin and Sebastian and to open the session. Thank you all for your participation. Yes, Saniye, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Özlem. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online event, which is organized, as Özlem just said, by Dokuz University Department of Philosophy and Turkey Kant Society. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. First, I'd like to note that we will be recording the panel, and the video of the panel is being broadcasted live on the Dokuz University's Faculty of Letters YouTube channel and could be viewed later on YouTube channel of Turkey Kant Society as well. And secondly, I'd also like to take this opportunity to refer to the Turkey Kant Society, which was founded last year, and we also founded a new academic journal, Konuşmanın, which aims to publish original works in Kantian philosophy. For more information about Turkey Kant Society and our journal, Konuşmanın, please check out these websites. I am now putting them on chat box. Sorry. Yep. And finally, please remain muted during the talks. And if you want to ask a question, we will have a Q&A session after each talk. Please use the raise hand icon. And while asking a question, you can either unmute yourself, or if you have connection problems, you can use the chat function. And if the connection is bad, you could also switch off your video. And if you encounter serious problems, please try to join the meeting from your phone. After these preliminary announcements, now I'd like to introduce you our first speaker, Sebastian Orlander. Sebastian Orlander is a PhD student at Keele University in the UK, currently finishing on a project on Kant's notion of the world and its systematic function in the three critiques. Sebastian studied at Miami University of Ohio and at the University of Memphis before being admitted for a PhD studentship at Keele University. And apart from working on Kant, he's also interested in the history of early modern philosophy more generally, and particularly in Hume and Spinoza, as well as the 20th century philosophy phenomenology. The title of his paper today is Kant a Fictionalist? So let's applaud our first speaker, Sebastian. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for having me. So, is Kant a fictionalist? Just as a preliminary note, I thought I'd be writing a 20 to 30 page paper, and I wound up with 50 pages. So I'll be reading some and talking the rest as much as I have time to present everything. But yeah, like it's a rich topic, so hopefully I can share some of what I've been working on here. So. Interpreting Immanuel Kant's writings seems to be accompanied by both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, amateur and professional interpreters alike are provided with a plethora of approaches to understanding his text, and a wide variety of possible use can be attributed to him. But on the other hand, the dearth of consensus about what some of his central claims amount to, and the frustration of trying to reconcile the seemingly incompatible views that are sometimes presented side by side in his writings, can make a scrupulous reader lay down the text in bafflement and consternation. So the topic at hand, fictionalism, is no different. In this paper, I will argue that Kant should be re-examined as to whether or not one can attribute some views that could be called fictionalist. So, as a background, recently in contemporary metaphysics, a position has started to crystallize itself that has come to be called fictionalism. In short, it treats a variety of discourses with questionable theoretical standing as fictions. It is usually cast as an anti-realist position, not strongly skeptical or even opposed to working with particular discourses that use ontologies that are, well, suspect, and it accepts the truth of these discourses while at the same time also maintaining a certain sort of distant, epistemically merely accepting rather than believing position to them. To cite one example of this, suppose one reads David Lewis's account of modal logic, and which is known as modal realism, and it's presented as a plausible reduction of modal notions like possibility and necessity down to more basic first order type logic, and yet the ontological consequences of this particular treatment of modal logic seems to be the belief in the existence of an infinite number of concrete worlds. It's usually considered that, well, most audio issue here.
We can hear you without the headphones.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, no, it's just this usually helps with concentrating the audio, but I guess it's not working at the moment. So, in any case, so David Lewis's modal realism usually presents itself as an acceptable treatment of modal notions for nominalistically inclined metaphysicians. And fictionalism at this point enters in and says that, well, we can accept this analysis of modality while not necessarily accepting the, well, it seems distasteful ontological consequences of the infinite concreta. This is one notion in particular. It's an early paper by Gideon Rosen from the 1990s. Now, fictionalism as a position for the more historically knowledgeable reader and philosopher is also a position that was developed by the philosopher and Kant scholar Hans Vaillinga in the early 20th century, although he had already developed the position by the late 19th century, sometime in the 1870s. For most Kant scholars, Vaillinga is primarily known as the scholar who first formulated the patchwork thesis regarding the historical genesis of the transcendental deduction. But his systematic work is also of interest here, and actually was quite well discussed in academic circles since it was first published in 1911 until, well, the takeover of National Socialism in Germany and the onset of World War II. After that, it's sort of dissipated from academic interest due to the, well, reformation of various schools, the takeover of logical positivism or logical empiricism in English-speaking philosophy departments and so on. So it's gone out of philosophical fashion by accident, and so is not particularly well known except for in some contexts like modeling in the philosophy of science, or in the context of discussing legal fictions in the philosophy of law. However,
it's particularly remarkable considering that now we have a new variety of fictionalism that's come onto the scene in contemporary metaphysics that just hasn't really concerned itself with this sort of classical formulation of fictionalism. So what I want to do with this paper is to sort of shed light on well, the Kantian grounds of Weier's fictionalism from Die Philosophie des Als Ob, and to see whether or not one can actually formulate a distinctly Kantian position within this contemporary debate. So in this paper, I will first examine a sense of what is fiction or fictionalist in treatments, so that could be useful in a philosophical sense. Secondly, I want to analyze some distinct trends within the contemporary fictionalism in metaphysics and try to probe what the philosophical motivations are behind this strategy more than what I've already adumbrated. And third, I want to analyze the original formulation of fictionalism in Baiasu, and then move on to give a particular reading of a passage from the Critique of Pure Reason to see whether or not we can actually attribute this view to Kant, and then to see whether this can be productively used for particular debates in contemporary metaphysics. So the word fiction carries a number of unfortunate connotations that make it perhaps singularly unfit as the name of a particular doctrine. So just as idealism conjures up, well, the doctrine of Berkeley that esse is percipi, and the surrounding controversy around this, fiction also has particularly negative connotations. It evokes something rather trivial, like the fiction section in a bookstore, where one finds perhaps artifacts of aesthetic enjoyment and perhaps have some value, but are most would seriously consider as unrelated to fact, and thus shouldn't be considered seriously. Another thing that might be suggested by the word fiction is perhaps a certain kind of narrative that one would otherwise deploy in a more serious context, but rather as a strategy of deception. So to quote an apt line from the John Ford Western, "The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when legend becomes fact, print the legend." So here we have a notion of fiction where it's really just used for the purpose of creating hagiography or triumphalist history, but it certainly isn't something that somebody with a scientific disposition would study to gain a true version of events. And the same can be said for natural scientific discourses, so that, well, we know that there have been previous ways of, previous assumptions and ways of studying the natural world, like perhaps naive teleological assumptions or naive astronomy. But once we have established something that has real empirical and testable results, we can't really treat these previous frameworks, except maybe in some sense as fiction. However, fiction, if taken literally, does have other potential meanings. If one consults just dictionaries in the English language, one finds that, well, one very often finds that the first meaning of the word does indicate this this feature that, well, it's an invented or imagined narrative that is not true, and this connection that, well, it's an invented or imagined narrative that is used as a lie. But then if one looks at the etymological root of the word, one finds that the word is derived from the Latin word fingere, which simply means to form. So it simply indicates that, well, here is something artificial, but rather it is not necessarily something that is, well, deceptive. It might involve an assumption, for example, when one is using an argument and when one is constructing an argument and one starts from an assumption that one hasn't yet proved to be true, one, say, makes an assumption merely for the sake of argument, one can go on and proceed with the argument and then not worry about the truth of that particular assumption, at least for the sake of the argument. So one should perhaps then, in philosophical context, be able to distinguish between treating something as true and knowing that it is false, or not caring that it is either false or true, and then holding something as a particular kind of assumption for the sake of some other kind of practical matter. Now, moving on to the state of contemporary metaphysics with regards to fictionalism, a short overview will show you that it is primarily a strategy for treating a particular target discourse as true, but not to take it as true simpliciter, but rather to take a modified standpoint as to just like whether or not one actually believes this discourse, as mentioned before. Now, there are a wide variety of fictionalisms that are discussed in the literature, and recent edited collections show that there are a number of distinct positions systematically that one can take. So, for example, there is hermeneutic fictionalism, which seems to be the more accepted version of this theory, which is primarily an epistemic theory. So as the modifier shows, hermeneutic, it says that, well, we take a particular kind of interpretation of a target discourse such that, well, we accept the truth values of what these discourses formally, but we actually don't believe that this is really true for the world. We only believe it insofar as we want to use this discourse for summary for some purpose or another. Contrast this with revolutionary fictionalism, where it really does come with some serious revisionary assumptions about the ontology that it treats as fictional. And of course, there's also distinctions to be made between other kinds of non-realist or anti-realist positions in this family, so that fictionalism has to be distinguished from reductionism as such, as we've already seen with David Lewis's modal realism. That is a particular kind of reductionism that fictionalism actually denies, at least for the sake of not accepting the ontology that it comes with. But it's also distinct from particular kinds of non-factualist positions like emotivism or expressivism, or those particular kinds of metaethical theories that actively deny that these are truth-apt discourses. So this is still a kind of strategy that licenses realist types of treatments of discourse, while at the same time withholding some sort of assent to these theories. Now, looking at the historical genesis of the contemporary position, it's a bit unclear how exactly this came about. Very often fingers are pointed at two works from 1980, that is Bas van Vrazen's The Scientific Image and Hartree-Field's Science Without Numbers, which make particular statements about the nature of scientific inquiry or of mathematics, and that we don't need to treat these as discourses involving truth, that we can simply dispense with those types of assumptions. Problem, of course, with that attribution is that Van Vrazen actively has denied that he is a fictionalist, and Field has not said particularly much either way about whether or not he is or is not a fictionalist. So now moving on to what I think probably is the seminal paper, although if somebody knows better, then please correct me at the end of the paper. Gideon Rosen proposes the already alluded to fictionalist strategy of treating David Lewis's modal realist framework as a particular kind of fiction. And now it does this by looking at, well, the analysis of modal statements like there might have been blue swans if and only if there is a world W such that at W there are blue swans. Recognize this from Lewis's treatment of counterfactuals. And then the worry comes up once we acknowledge that, well, deductively it follows that we should also believe the proposition there is a non-actual possible world at which there are blue swans. Now, obviously, metaphysically speaking, we can treat this kind of statement in two ways. Either it's an abstract object or it's a concrete object. And while most would say that, well, this is the prime case of an abstract object, Lewis famously takes the other tack and says, well, this is a concrete object, with the consequence that, well, in modal space, there are an infinite possible number of worlds where a world is a concrete, spatiotemporally extended as the object. Now, while this, as a nominalist strategy for reducing modal talk, it's a very strange way of going about it, because nominalism tends to be the paragon of ontological parsimony, at least within this sort of field of Quinean metaphysics. And here we have a rather extraordinary claim that some would say is just, well, the exact opposite of ontological parsimony. So thus, to quote Rosen, to embrace modal realism is to undertake a massive revision in the worldview we bring with us to philosophy. And it may be that in spite of everything Lewis says, in spite of the many ways in which he shows his hypothesis to be fruitful in systematic metaphysics, one still finds oneself unable to assent to it. This is the significance of the incredulous stare, and Lewis is right to say that he cannot refute it because it is not an argument. It is rather an expression of the degree to which, given our starting point, modal realism with its commitment to countless non-actual talking donkeys and the like must strike us as utterly incredible. Now, Rosen's strategy to just counter the incredulous stare is just to say that, well, these types of statements, modal statements, are actually much more like this other class of statements, like there is a brilliant detective at 22-1B Baker Street. So referring to the fictional character Sherlock Holmes. And now, while at first glance this sounds strange, particularly because of the other, this seems to connect the metaphysical problem of modal statements with the other metaphysical problems of negative existentials. It seems that here is a possibility that, well, we do accept these sorts of statements as true once we put a prefix, a logical prefix to this type of statement, such that we wind up with a sentence like, in the Holmes stories, there is a brilliant detective at 221B Baker Street. So thus it exploits the principle that according to the fiction F, some X is P, it can be treated as true without believing actually that some X is P. The former does not usually entail the latter. Now, the obvious benefits of this type of strategy, as Rosen lays it out, is that, well, it doesn't come with any revisionary ontological consequences. It's unclear what stories are perhaps in this theory, but this doesn't need to be of concern, at least at first glance. And then epistemologically, it is much less controversial than just any sort of realist theory, staying out with the modal realism, because the way that Lewis, well, develops the logical principles that he starts with in order to arrive at his position is self-acknowledgedly like something where he's merely starting from these logical principles and then developing them using one's imagination. The problem, of course, is that it's not exactly clear why we should treat our imagination in applying these logical principles as completely reliable to map out this logical space. I'm not sure he's echoing Kant here, but one might recognize the Kant of the 1772 letter to Hertz in this quote. After all, there might have been creatures whose imaginative principles were quite out of step with the distribution of worlds in modal space. how is it that we are so lucky to have been given the right imaginative dispositions? So, as the comparison shows, I think this already shows that there is perhaps a certain sort of affinity to the kind of position that one might get if one tries to draw out those kinds of parts from Kant's own philosophy. How am I doing on time?
You have 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll have to skip all of the problems that I point out with just metaphysics as presented right now. We'll talk about that later. So, but now on to Vainga. Now, so Vainga is very important figure in the history of Kant scholarship, but his influence is perhaps less noticeable now than at any point earlier. So as mentioned, he developed the patchwork thesis, and then as a systematic philosopher, he developed the view has come to be known as fictionalism in Die Philosophie des Als-Ob. Now, the view that is called fictionalism there is actually quite different from what we have in contemporary fictionalism, since most fictionalism now uses the story prefix in order to exploit how we treat fictions, whereas Vainga actually thinks that fiction, that we treat problematic ontological or metaphysical notions rather more like metaphorical language than these other philosophers do, although that doesn't by any means that there are no contemporary fictionalists that think that metaphysics works more like metaphorical language than this kind of story prefix type metaphysics. So in Vainga, we get a particularly kind of naturalistic and phenomenalist spin on these types of considerations. So just looking at the first sentence of Die Philosophie des Als-Ob, he states, scientific thought is a function of the psyche. By the term psyche, we do not understand its substance, but the organic whole of all so-called mental actions and reactions, and these never come under external observation, but have to be partly inferred from physical signs, partly observed by the so-called inner sense. So it's quite different from the starting point of most contemporary metaphysics. It's also quite different from the starting point of Kant, to be fair, as well. And Vainga is certainly aware of this, although he didn't exactly stop him from appropriating a lot of Kantian texts to support the historical background of his views. But at the same time, the sort of attribution of phenomenalism to Kant was probably less problematic than it is today, where we have a number of competing positions to attributing this type of metaphysical and Cartesian view to Kant. So another thing then to notice that with this naturalism is that he has a particular view about what he calls the primacy of practical. The phrase itself doesn't appear in Vainga. It actually derives from Fichte, which sort of changes the well-known phrase from Kantian philosophy regarding the primacy of practical reason. But what it sort of points out is that the real value of these theoretical constructs and so on is in order to allow for more experience and for more realizations of particular goals in our natural environment. So, for example, Vainga reads on the value of these fictions: it is rather the practical test as to whether it is possible with the help of those logical products to calculate events that occur without our intervention and to realize our impulses appropriately in accordance with the direction of the logical structures. So, and of course, here we also notice that Weyenger's fictionalism is while of course being an original claim of his own, as in a way he wears his historical influences on his sleeve as far as that goes, where he cites Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and a number of other German materialists from the late 19th century to sort of compare his own view to. So, okay, long quote now. So the main thing to notice then with Weyenger's fictionalism is that he distinguishes two kinds of fictionalism, fictions that we come up with. True fiction, formulated in a strictly scientific manner, is always accompanied by the consciousness that the fictional idea, the fictional assumption, has no real validity. The fiction most important historically, for example, the Linnaean system, Adam Smith's theory, and in part the atomic theory and the differential calculus demonstrate this fact. It may be added that the consciousness with which scientific fictions are framed also extends to the realization that they are either merely provisional concepts destined to be replaced later or corrected, or are simply there to facilitate logical communication. The first alternative is more usual in semi-fictions, and the second in real fictions. The former are historically provisional, the latter logically provisional fictions. The former disappears in the course of time, the latter are omitted in the course of the operation. If we mean by a mistake a deviation from reality and by an error a contradictory concept, then we can call the semi-fictions conscious mistakes and the real fictions conscious errors or conscious contradictions. And the one group tending to serve purely practical purposes, the other theoretical. The former are used for more logical operations, the latter for understanding. And while the semi-fiction leads us back to methodological motives, the real fiction leads us to those connected with the theory of knowledge. So what has to then distinguish between true fictions and semi-fictions, true fictions being the kinds of fictions where the concept at bottom is self-contradictory. The example he cites there that's probably most historically familiar from controversies in mathematics is the infinitesimal, which at introduction allowed for a variety of applications, the advancement of mathematical physics and so on, and then people like Berkeley and so on, has come along and say, well, there's something fishy about this notion, because the notion of an infinitely small point just doesn't seem to make any sense. For semi-fictions, the best example sort of to use there that he talks about it is the notion of the homo economicus from Adam Smith. The historical evidence he shows for this is a bit shaky, but he claims that Smith's original proposal for systematizing political economy, the study of political economy in the way that he does, actually involves a fictional assumption of an idealized actor. Now, the reason why it's fictional is that, well, Adam Smith tries to come up with a way to explain human action through a theory of causation, but the only way he can do this is by idealizing all motivation down to what he assumes is the most efficacious, which is egoism, and then that then gives the grounding for the subsequent investigations in political economy. But then here one sees that, okay, this is not a necessarily self-contradictory concept, merely that it makes a conscious departure from reality, because, well, if we go out into the world and find economic actors, we find that their motivations are one is different from the other, and we're not all guided by egotism, but that doesn't necessarily disprove the validity of the theory as far as making particular kinds of predictions, or in order to use this as a particular kind of tool for talking about these systems. It, of course, can be refined and assumptions rejected over time and so on, but that doesn't negate the practical value of that kind of theory. And here one sees that the real goal of Weyenger's theory is just to show that we rely on fictions in a variety of contexts where we do seem to be interested in truth, but even systematically for him, we can't even really get at truth ever, because as a phenomenalist, the only reality that he thinks we are immediately ever aware of is the reality of our own sensations. So everything kind of becomes a fictionalist, a fiction. Now, this is an obvious problem with Weier's framework, since it just overinflates the use of fiction there. And if I had had more time or had been better prepared, I would have introduced this in a little bit more of a systematic way. But that's I think the real value of the theory as presented. Now, as far as attributing this view to Kant, this brings us then to how he introduces the theory as such, because he thinks that it uses a particular feature of language in discussing as-if formulations, because as-if formulations are a bit strange, since they look like analogies, but they aren't real analogies, since we don't compare two dissimilar things with regards to some feature that they share in common, but rather the feature that the thing that's being compared, it rather displaces the thing completely formally, such that one can operate on it through the kinds of logical tools that, well, we have as cognitive beings. And this is, of course, something that Weier attributes to Kant as well, and he cites a variety of passages to show this, that, well, these kinds of formulations show up everywhere, as far as Kant talking about the theoretical value of metaphysics, even though he denies that we can extend cognition to objects like the soul, the world, or God. He at the same time says that, well, they can fulfill certain kinds of regulative functions, and they have an indispensable role in practical philosophy as far as being the minimal theoretical assumptions we have to make in order for morality itself to make sense. I mean, to a certain extent, Kantian practical philosophy operates outside of having to make those sorts of assumptions, but even so, things like the postulates of pure practical reason, like the immortality of the soul and the existence of God, they're theoretical assumptions, even though it's just like they're formulated through certain kinds of practical warrant. I have a whole section on Atticus's critique of Weyer, which I'll have to skip here because I want to get to Kant a little bit. Shortly, Atticus thinks that Weyer is a great scholar, but the book on fictionalism is shoddy scholarship, and he overstates how much these grammatical formulations actually involve irrealities, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So moving on to Kant, I think one can salvage something of a fictionalism out of Kant, merely just particularly looking at the section on the final aim of the natural dialectic of human reason. So the second appendix to the transcendental dialectic, particularly because there he offers the transcendental deduction of the ideas of reason. Now, one should first point out that he doesn't intend it to be anything like the transcendental deduction of the categories of the understanding, because the categories of understanding have to have a constitutive use in experience. What does that mean? It means that in order for experience itself to make sense, we have to be able to establish that that these categories, so the 12 categories of the understanding, have a necessary application to experience. The ideas of reason can't have that. The dialectic shows that if we try to use the ideas of reason, we that actually fall into error, because these ideas are inherently illusory. However, Kant has a particular kind of teleological view of the cognitive faculties of the mind, I can't argue for it here, so just assume that it's true. So one problem that comes up there is that, well, the mind produces these ideas, but it can't be that they're merely illusory. They have to have some sort of a use in experience. And thus he has to justify some use whatever in experience that doesn't generate the kinds of errors that the transcendental illusion then conjures up. So I propose a reading of the appendix here, where I give a schema of an argument that is there, to show that, well, he does seem to argue that we can treat the ideas as a kind of fiction in order to be able to extend the use of our of the categories of the understanding even to cases of, well, future experience, so that new applications can also be unified with past applications of the understanding. So first passage I draw on says this, quote, "It is not from a simple thinking substance that we derive the inner appearances of our soul, but from one another in accordance with the idea of a simple being. It is not from the highest intelligence that we derive the order of the world and its systematic unity, but rather it is from the idea of the most wise cause that we take the rule that reason is best off using for its own satisfaction when it connects up causes and effects in the world." So the ideas of reason aren't something that we can assume simply off the bat just to explain the way our experiences are unified. Rather, they are the products of our attempt to unify experience. So they're particular kinds of logical products from there. Secondly, thus, they should not be assumed in themselves, but the reality should hold only as that of a schema of the regulative principle for the systematic unity of all cognitions of nature. Hence, they should be grounded only as analogues of real things, but not as things in themselves. So because they are particular kinds of products of logical applications of, or well, the transcendental applications of the categories of the understanding to experience, we can take these as schemas for how we can try to unify experience as a whole, even though for reasons given already in the dialectic, we can't actually arrive at the full unification of experience. Thirdly, also this means that, particularly with regards to the idea of God, it allows us to imagine what it would be like for an infinite knower to actually unify everything, even though this is only a standpoint from the finite knower to try and occupy that standpoint of the infinite knower, so to try and give a critical use of that notion. So if accordingly we assume such ideal entities, then we do not really extend our cognition beyond the objects of possible experience, but only extend the empirical unity of these objects through the systematic unity for which the idea gives us the schema. Hence, the idea holds not as a constitutive, but merely as a regulative concept. So this clarifies how we're supposed to use these notions. So, fourth, the highest formal unity that alone rests on the concepts of reason is the purpose of unity of things, and the speculative interest of reason makes it necessary to regard every ordinance in the world as if it had sprouted from the intention of a highest reason. So, this then gives what the highest possible way of just trying to unify experience goes, and then the kind of a target, as it were, just like that, our speculative interest aims at in trying to use these ideas, while still only treating them as analogous to the metaphysical entities that we kind of naively assume that that they refer to. So then, conclusion: the greatest systematic unity, consequently also purpose of unity, is the school and even the ground of possibility of the greatest use of human reason. Hence, the idea of its inseparably of it is inseparably bound up with the essence of our reason. The very same idea, therefore, is legislative for us, and thus it is very natural to assume a corresponding legislative reason, intellectus archetypus, from which all systematic unity of nature as the objects of our reason is to be derived. So this then gives how we are supposed to then understand how the use of the ideas of reason as a particular kind of fiction then allows us to extend just like our use of reason as generally. And what this in particular allows us to do is to treat metaphysics as a very sort of precise discipline. It says later in the doctrine of method that, well, in metaphysics, morals, and mathematics, we aren't really allowed to form mere opinions, since mere opinion is merely a question of probability where one can be right or wrong regarding the question of the matter of fact. The problem, of course, with metaphysics, unlike morality and mathematics, is that we have no we can't be absolutely sure, at least from a merely theoretical standpoint, what things we can hold to be true simpliciter. Once we get to practical philosophy, a number of metaphysical assumptions can be made without much further problem. But this way, at least, of regulatively using the ideas of reason and trying to form certain sorts of analogical claims about the supersensible substratum of experience, as we can assume a certain sort of standpoint from which to conduct empirical science, or even to just like conduct practical sciences like medicine. For example, he applies this notion to medicine as the notion of a teleologically organized organic body actually makes no sense theoretically if we proceed merely from what is given in experience. It's something that he treats, at least, as something that we assume when we approach bodies. And then once we get to medicine, of course, we assume a notion of health when approaching a particular kind of body. And we obviously have just pragmatic and practical results from making that assumption, even though it can't be justified completely a priori. But it seems that we perhaps don't need the sort of justification that the pre-critical philosopher demands in this case, that we can actually maintain this quasi-skeptical position with regards to the objects of metaphysics. And I think in this sense, we can actually, this forms the grounds for at least a kind of fictionalism that could then be formulated to be used for formulating a distinct position in contemporary metaphysics, particularly with regards to well, perhaps we treat certain things as fictional, but also we can articulate that we are practically committed to perhaps the existence of something, even though theoretically we might not articulate the same sort of certainty in the same way that the fictionalist currently says, well, we can perhaps be skeptical or withholding of our assent to the existence of a certain kind of theoretical entity, but practically we are at least committed to something like the existence of those types of entities once we enter into those types of activities that rely on them. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Sebastian for his thought-provoking and very interesting paper. So now we can receive the questions for Sebastian's presentation. Those who want to raise a question, please use the raise hand button. By clicking on the reactions, you'll see the raise hand button. Or if you prefer, you can also write down your question to the chat box. Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'll start with a perhaps relatively simple question of clarification, because one thing which seemed to me to be the case was that you presented a plausible account of how Kant could be read as a fictionalist. But then the details of the interpretation, in the details of the interpretation, I couldn't see anything that I would have thought is problematic. So by and large, I agreed with you that that's a plausible reading of Kant. And I was wondering, but I'm sure I'm missing something. So I wanted to ask you, where do you see potentially problematic aspects of this interpretation? Why do you think seeing Kant as potentially a fictionalist is just a way of reviving what Wenger has done already, or is it a bit more than that? How do you think that reading is contributing in the current landscape of various interpretations of Kant? Thank you.
I mean, as far as current interpretations of Kant go, I think what is the one thing to point out is that it's probably complementary to the kinds of readings of Kant that have been, I guess, currently are referred to as methodological or epistemic readings of transcendental idealism. So the kind that Allison and Michel Greer and Graham Bird and so all of these figures have still offered. It's just perhaps that it's I need to work out just where exactly they might disagree on some things there, and it might just be a question of what it lays a particular accent on. It might even be that, I mean, there's going to be a question there of just how much there's going to be a real debate and real disagreement with each other over this question, and whether or not it's just a verbal disagreement, particularly because Weinger's particular way of going at things. And I'm not saying that I agree with Weinger's analysis for the reasons that I brought up. I think the naturalism in Weinger's reading of Kant is his attribution of fictionalism, his own fictionalism, in part to Kant. He's critical of Kant in some places, and I couldn't get into it quite. But in some places, Weinger thinks Kant is being, a good proto-fictionalist, and is being skeptical and pessimistic, and is sort of denies that we can't have knowledge. And then in other places, he thinks that Kant is just being a dogmatic rationalist, like Leibniz and Wolff and the other German school philosophers before him. So he has a mixed view there, and I think that there's certain aspects of Weinger's evaluation of Kant's philosophy that, I don't think are really salvageable, because I don't think that you can really read Kant against the grain that much. In a way, I agree that minimally with Oedipus, for example, when he says that, well, Kant just straight away just accepted the existence of things in themselves and of God and the immortality of the soul and freedom and so on. Like these things were never really up for debate with him. I do think Kant is at times skeptical, or at least like he does worry about having real theoretical warrant for accepting these sorts of beliefs. But I think he definitely was more dogmatic than perhaps Weyer lets on. I think the fictionalist interpretation is probably more of a criticism of the kinds of metaphysical interpretations of Kant that are still around, where I think that here's a very straightforward way of looking at some of the things Kant has to say regarding the way we treat metaphysical objects analogically. There's been a number of publications recently on symbolic anthropomorphism and how he actually manages to deploy the type of metaphysical discourse in various types of contexts where the justification therefore seems, to me at least, strange sometimes, but I think interesting, and it sort of warrants looking at using fictionalism to describe how he uses analogy in those particular kinds of cases. But I think it's more evidence and more argumentation for viewing Kant as not as a Cartesian philosopher, not as a metaphysical philosopher, but as sort of just like proposing something that is anti-metaphysical, even though, like the contemporary fictionalists now, it still uses metaphysical discourse, but for other purposes, like for practical purposes in particular. I hope that helps, that answers it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebastian. And Özgür Gürsay.
Merhaba herkese. Thank you for your presentation. Maybe I can pick up from this issue pertaining to different readings of Kant, metaphysical versus epistemological, methodological. I was wondering if you could unpack a little more what the force of a notion like fiction for you is. So towards the end, especially, you emphasized how, okay, we don't need to think about these certain, metaphysical ideas as giving us a priori knowledge of, the thing in itself world, the way things are. We can think about them as fictions. But also, it seemed to me you didn't simply want to say that, oh, this is just regulative, to systematize, organize our knowledge. You said that we are practically committed to these ideas, which sort of make me wonder about the cognitive value of these ideas. I mean, this is, an old question with respect to Kant. What if someone were to say that, well, if you just mean that you couldn't act, if you didn't somehow believe in these things as real, then, that's why we accept them. Well, tough luck. We then just don't, we don't act if that's what you mean by action. And then that way of sort of devil's advocate type of question brings to my mind the sort of post-Kantian German idealist development of this notion. That's where, even though sort of traditionally there's a tendency to dismiss the likes of Hegel as giving us an ontological or metaphysical reading, nonetheless, clearly what they're trying to do is sort of start from within Kant and locate certain dissatisfactions within the system itself. For example, there are such things as, organic wholes, aesthetic appreciation of beauty, which types of experience themselves seem to require revision in Kantian dualities. And then, of course, if we're still going to call these ideas fictions, in that development, it seems to me at least get a sense that these fictions have something like constitutive force, if we're still going to use, that opposition between constitutive and regulative, namely in the construction of social reality. In other words, so on the one hand, this, attempt to leave Kant behind, but maybe in one word, if I were to ask you the question, if we accept sort of your reading of Kant as a fictionalist, sort of what, if any, cognitive value do you find in the notion of fiction, and are you satisfied with that? I'll stop there.
So I'm not sure I can answer the question directly, just because it would take me too long to actually figure out how to do that. But I love the fact that you mentioned the sort of just like the constitutive reality of social institutions and that sort of question, because I think what one can do is basically just try and look at how the kind of treatment of metaphysical ideas as fiction can also just like be traced back to Kant, as far as just like being able to show that these are already active in particular kinds of social institutions and arrangements. So I mean, this is something that just like very often gets traced back to the later German idealists like Fichte and Hegel, and it's just like we have to look at Sittlichkeit and all of that sort of thing to see how the ideas really become manifest in our experience. But in a sense, I think, I mean, I read the Doctrine of Right, and some of the metaphors that, you know, show up in the Doctrine of Right are fascinating. I mean, on the one hand, he starts talking about how there's an analogy to be made between Newton's third laws of action and reaction, and of sort of just like the mutual the interaction and imposition of rights and duties between moral agents. So, and like, I always found that really strange, but then similar things crop up later where he treats material reality in a sense as a sign of metaphysical relations manifesting themselves already. So like when he talks about making contracts between each other, how you determine when it actually happens, he points out that, well, it's a bit strange to sort of apply temporality to this question, because, well, what we're really talking about is between two agents that are in spatio-temporal. So we're talking is making an agreement between each other. So it can't really be in time. But in order to facilitate the interaction, we symbolize this by, well, handshaking or breaking of sticks to symbolize, well, from this point, or, well, signing contracts and pen and paper to symbolize that, well, now this particular kind of metaphysical relation takes force in experience. So it's in physical reality. So I think that, and I haven't worked this out completely yet, but I think that it's just that one can, from the regulative use of reason, of the ideas of reason in for theoretical explanation, move towards how Kant then sees how he's actually worried about how we don't just use these ideas relatively to like explain nature, but also to intervene in nature and to, well, create a social reality. There's a passage from the Third Critique that I think illustrates that as well, as far as, well, seeing how the legislation of practical and of theoretical reason sort of just like has to come together in the field of experience, so that, well, we only have one territory on which to fit two sets of legislation on. So I don't know how quite to get from the one to the other, but I do think that he is very, very much worried about this, and it shows up in his work on religion as well, which I'm not terribly familiar with, but I do think that, you know, the little I have read shows that, you know, there's something there as well, and which is also like historically influential because of the work of the way Kant was received by liberal theologians like Schleiermacher. So that's another like historical point.
Thank you.
Bülent Hocam, buyurun.
Sebastian, thank you for your talk, but I'm not very sure I very well understand you, but to consider Kant as a fictional philosopher, the criteria which you have in your mind, I think can be applied to all of philosophy, all of history of philosophy, or to the all metaphysicians. And so there's no too much interesting thing here. Can you tell me a non-fictionalist philosopher? For example, maybe you have in your mind a logical empiricist, Carnap or Ryan. Can you tell me, really? I'm wondering about that. Who is non-fictionalist?
Yeah, I think Quine is a particularly good example of that particular kind of non-fictionalist attitude, although I think Quine is probably a bad example of that as well, because of just all of the compromises he has to make over his career, you know, just like when he lets mathematics back in because mathematics is indispensable for natural science. So let's not worry about whether or not these are abstract objects or not. And the same can be said there. I think this is why I think Carnap actually has a much better framework, because the internal external distinction he has for discourses, I think actually it's just can be used to sort of motivate certain sorts of fictionalist considerations. And I think Stephen Yablo has done that as well. And so I think that's more important. But I think, so, I mean, there's that. I see your point, and I think it certainly applies to Weingart as well, where he certainly thought that just like a lot of philosophers were fictionalists just because he liked them and because he was inspired by them to formulate this. And there's a certain inflationary tendency in doing this, because, well, particularly once you assume something like phenomenalism and you think that, well, the only thing that is really real is sensation, then everything becomes a sort of fiction that we use to manipulate reality. But I think that, you know, pre-critical philosophy falls into this type of kind of literalists is a tendency, except for maybe the more extreme nominalists. So like Berkeley uses the notion of fiction because of his phenomenalism in part. Like, just I think the example he discusses in the Principles of Human Knowledge is the abstract idea of a general triangle. And of course, well, I don't know what this is, because a triangle has to be one of just the, you know, the various different kinds that they are. I can't imagine a triangle that isn't any one of those specific three. So it's just a fiction. But then that would make, I think, just staying with that example, that would make Locke a non-fictionalist, because he certainly thinks that it's just like abstract ideas are things that, you know, we can't take literally. And I think, well, Platonists, I think, of some variety would have to be some sort of literalist as well, because, well, if you talk about referring to abstract objects directly, or referring to universals, and then, you know, questions come up, are universals contained completely or partially only in their instantiations, then, well, I do think they're using something like quasi-literal discourse rather than merely a fictional discourse. So I hope that clears it up a little bit.
It's not, but it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Bülent Hocam. If there are no other questions, I'm going to abuse my position and I'll ask a tiny question. So I loved how you presented this alternative account of fictionalism, because generally when we think about fictionalism, we think about it has to be the product of imagination, it can't be really rational, and that it is opposed to truth and reality. But now you, with your examples, you showed that there's an alternative theory of fiction here. And I think you're right that we can find some fictionalism in Kant, as Bülent Hocam mentioned, maybe in many other philosophers, but maybe rather than just a suggestion, a quick note, rather than emphasizing the analogy part, maybe you can emphasize the constructive part or inventive part of fiction, right? When you have a fictionalist account, you are inventing something rather than discovering something. So maybe the dogmatists before Kant thought that they are discovering the truths out there through reason, but with Kant, what you have is rather you are inventing or constructing the truth, the reality that you can have access to through reason. So construction part, I think maybe is what you can emphasize. And also in your appeal to Homo economica of Adam Smith, that semi-fiction, it seems to me, is about describing an ideal case, again, a construction of reason, an ideal, maybe a human being. And we see a bunch of examples in Kant, right? He assumes an ideal cognizer, he assumes an ideal ethical community, he makes a reference to an ideal moral agent, etc., and then talks about and those, right? And maybe they are not true in the sense of maybe correspondence theory of truth, right? Because there are no such ideal cases, and maybe in that respect they are false. Nancy Cartwright, for example, thinks that all scientific theories are false, precisely because, you know, they don't really describe matters of fact in the world. They describe things that don't exist in the world. But when you have a coherence account of truth, then you can say this makes sense and it has a value in my system, and that is the regulative value, and that these ideal cognizer, etc., they can have this kind of truth. So they don't have to be completely false in the sense of, you know, in the way that Nancy Cartwright would say. So then my comment is just maybe as not more than a, rather than a question, it's a suggestion. Maybe just focus on this constructive activity of fiction and maybe refer to this constructive activity in Kant, plus rather than emphasizing on you know, the semi-fiction as a case of describing this maybe non-existing things, just describing ideal things. What would you say to this suggestion?
I understand sort of the tendency of looking more at the construction bit rather than the bit. I'm familiar a little bit with those kinds of anti-realisms in the philosophy of science, but what I worry there with that particular tack on fictions and the way that we use is that it's either trivial, I think either trivially true, or there's a serious mistake in the offing. Why I think it's trivially true is for the same reason that Weingers points out that in that passage that I quoted, Kant refers to the ideas of reason as thought entities. While I do think Kant thinks that, well, they're a little bit more strongly than thought entities because they have this sort of vague objectivity to them, and they're certainly non-arbitrary because of the way that the ideas of the soul, world, and God are generated from the categories of the pure understanding. They still remain like thought entities. They're not empty, so unlike other notions that he discusses in the Amphiboly, but like they remain thought entities. So in a way, yes, all fictions are in some sense constructions, but where I worry is that Kant is always worried with both the categories and the ideas about just like what it is that we use to, or how we justify their use in experience, since they don't seem to have a natural connection to experience. So we can't assume necessarily that they are like teleologically organized in such a way that, you know, we can automatically use them without question on there, which is, you know, why we get the deduction and why we just get only 12 categories and why I only have 3 ideas, and yes, 3 ideas only have this regulative use. And I worry there that you know, not every fiction is created equally in some sense. And I mean, economic theory is probably a pretty good place to start, where it's just like one can wonder, you know, what the theoretical and practical benefits of the Homo economicus really was in the end. Because, well, on the one hand, there's I guess a true enough description of social reality in the late 18th century, and then, you know, various refinements of the idea up till now. But then you also get the policy prescriptions for states, and you get questions of, well, you know, they create their own reality in some sense by trying to implement these ideal models. And okay, so social sciences and policy questions and yeah, legal questions, that's one particularly weird example, because we try to implement them in some way, and we use, you know, the force of state apparatuses and so on in order to be able to do that. But then one can wonder, well, is this a good way to try and understand social relations, and then to try and create social relations that are based on those types of causal motivations in the first place? And I think that this holds generally, like, not every fiction is in some sense practical and pragmatically useful in either explaining or in manipulating reality. I mean, I think one particularly good criticism I read of David Lewis's modal realism was from Alexander Rosenberg, who actually, like, he cites Kant's transcendental aesthetic, where he says, well, you know, just because the notion of causally disconnected infinite spacetimes isn't understandable to us doesn't mean that it isn't true, but at the same time, it might not be meaningful or just cognitively significant for us to be able to understand what that theory in the end amounts to. So, I mean, my criticism of that particular fictionalism would be to say that, well, you know, maybe you should opt for a different kind of modal logic, because I don't really understand what modal realism actually amounts to. I mean, just to be a bit flippant, I think modal realists are fictionalists, in fact, because I don't know what infinite concrete worlds actually means. So I think, in fact, they are fictionalists. They just don't admit to that. But, well, that's another problem with fiction.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Thank you very much. Let's thank our speaker, Sebastian Orlander, for his very interesting and thought-provoking paper. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you our next speaker, Professor Sorin Baiasu, who is a professor of philosophy at Keele University. He is also the director of Keele, Oxford, St. Andrews Kantian Research Center. And he published one monograph and numerous other works. The title of his monograph is Compared Kant and Sartre, and had 5 edited collections, which include an edited book entitled Politics and Metaphysics in Kant, another one, Kant on Practical Justification, with Oxford University Press. And he published over 30 articles, mainly in ethics, metaphysics, and political philosophy, in journals such as Kant Studien, Kantian Review, and Journal of Political Philosophy. His research was funded, among others, by the British Academy, European Commission, and the European Research Council. Currently, he's writing another monograph entitled Kantian Justice, a responsibility-enhancing desert-sensitive theory. The title of his paper today is The Possibility of Kantian Armchair Knowledge. So the floor is yours, Professor Baiasu.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much once again to the organizers, Özlem in particular, and Saniye, but also to the host department and Turkey Kant Society, and to you all for being here. And it's a great pleasure to present this paper. I'm giving it for the first time here. It's a paper in which I'm trying to respond to some critical comments made by one of the most important current living philosophers, Adrian W. Moore. He is particularly special because he has a very thorough knowledge of Kant. And when he's providing objections to Kant, he's providing them against the background of a very, very good knowledge of Kant's philosophy. So that's particularly challenging. It's very interesting. So what I plan to do is I would like to actually, my plan was to do a PowerPoint presentation with some of the quotations, but running out of time, what I thought I would do would be to share the screen with the paper itself. I'm not going to read the paper, but I want to talk to the paper. But then in the paper, there are the quotations, and that might make it easier. Do you think that would be possible? I can see that the screen sharing was disabled. Is it possible to re-able it?
Now I allowed it.
Oh, thank you. Let's see whether I'm going to be able to. Yeah, this should be it, hopefully. Let's have a look. It's not this. This is just the YouTube. Let's have another look.
Yes, we can see it now.
Just one quick. Just want to make sure that this is the. Yeah, this is it. Great, because I highlighted in particular those sections I want to focus on. The paper is probably slightly longer than 30-40 minutes, but I'm just going to focus on those parts which are highlighted in particular. Okay, so here is, so what Moore does in this latest paper is to formulate a number of objections, and the objections basically are in the form of identifying conflicts within Kant's account. And those are supposed to be inner conflicts, if you want, contradictions within Kant's system. And they are supposed to be, as a result, more serious than some external types of objections. The starting point for Moore is a definition of what he calls armchair knowledge. So this is the kind of knowledge that the person who is just sitting in an armchair is able to have about the world without actually exploring the world. So the idea is a kind of rationalist idea. The idea is that we have certain knowledge about the world, and we have it in ourselves. And the question is, how is it possible, anything like this? So Moore defines armchair knowledge as knowledge that is independent of experience, in the sense that is not warranted by experience. He wants to distinguish between armchair knowledge and armchair related knowledge. So if I sit on an armchair and I see that it's comfortable, then that's again not armchair knowledge, because it's based on my experience of the armchair. So what he's talking about when he talks about armchair knowledge is knowledge acquired by the subject while seated in the armchair, and is knowledge about the world, as opposed to being simply knowledge about that armchair itself. Now, he of course clarifies that this is one of the oldest philosophical puzzles. It's generated by the fact that there seems to be such knowledge. Kant, for instance, claims we have such knowledge, but as I said, many rationalists made this claim that we have such knowledge. So because there is such knowledge, it's acquired without any use of any particular encounter with anything beyond the subject. And yet, some of it appears to concern what is beyond the subject. So on the one hand, we acquire this knowledge without any particular experience of what is beyond us. But at the same time, what we acquire is relevant to what is beyond us. And that seems quite puzzling. So the puzzle is summarized by Moore as follows. First, there is armchair knowledge. Secondly, some armchair knowledge concerns what is beyond the subject. And third, armchair knowledge does not involve any appeal to any particular encounter with anything beyond the subject. So that's the puzzle. We have armchair knowledge, it concerns what is beyond us, and nevertheless it doesn't involve any appeal to any particular encounter with anything beyond us. It sounds a bit like magic, and that always puzzles us. Okay. There are philosophers who think the puzzle can be solved, but they accept the three claims and they adopt a form of idealism. They claim that some of what is beyond the subject has a particular form, and that form depends on the subject. So they try to explain the puzzle of armchair knowledge by saying that what is beyond us has a particular form, and that form depends on us. So if we reflect on ourselves, on that form which is within us, then we should be able to say something also about what is beyond us, about the world, because the world is supposed to have that form which depends on us. So in that case, no use needs to be made in the acquisition of this knowledge of anything, of any kind of encounter with anything beyond the subject. And Moore thinks that this is the solution proposed by Kant. And he thinks that the attraction of this view goes beyond the puzzle of armchair knowledge, because it can answer a different puzzle, also a very old puzzle, namely the puzzle of knowledge of what is necessary. And even more so, knowledge of what is necessary as necessary. Again, another old philosophical problem that Kant claims he is able to solve, apart from the simple puzzle of armchair knowledge, there is this puzzle of knowledge of what is necessary. Now, what makes, in particular, this puzzle of knowledge of what is necessary interesting is that it presupposes that finite beings like us must have epistemic access to all the way things might have been. So the idea here is that if I have knowledge of what is necessary, then I have knowledge of something that couldn't have been otherwise. And that means an epistemic access to all the ways things might have been. And this is amazing because, of course, it seems like there could be an infinite ways in which things might have been. And the idea that we, finite beings, have access to this infinite range of possibilities, it's very interesting. Okay, now, Moore thinks that what Kant uses, and in general what is used in philosophy, in order to solve the puzzle of knowledge of what is necessary, is an attempt to ground necessity in contingency. And this means more than simply discovering that some apparent necessity is grounded in contingency. That's quite simple, he says. The idea is to ground necessity in contingency in such a way that we don't disrupt the appearance of necessity. In principle, if I think something is necessary, and then I discover that is underpinned by something contingent, then that thing which I thought was necessary becomes contingent as well. So the trick is to ground necessity in contingency in such a way that necessity doesn't disappear. And this is how Moore interprets Kant. He takes Kant's idealism to maintain that the part of the subject's armchair knowledge which pertains to that form, the form of what is known, which depends on the subject, is knowledge from a particular point of view. And a point of view, in principle, admits of alternatives. It's just one point of view. There are other points of view. Hence, the subjects having this point of view is the contingency in which the necessity is grounded. So the idea is that we have the subject. In Kant, we have the a priori structure of the mind of the subject. From the particular perspective of that subject, with that a priori structure, the subject will have a particular view of the world. That view of the world will need to meet certain conditions. It is necessary for it to meet certain conditions, the conditions given by the structure of the mind. Nevertheless, the point of view of the subject is contingent. There are other points of view as well. So we have the contingency and we have the necessity. The subject has pure intuitions of sensibility. That means that whatever the subject experiences in the world is going to be in space and time. This is the necessity. But we know that, according to Kant, other subjects may have different structures of sensibility. So that seems to be contingent. Moreover, there is nothing necessary in the fact that there are subjects, that there are human beings. The fact that there are human beings seems to be contingent. Okay, so at this point, Moore introduces this notion of I-dependence or idealism dependence. This is the dependence posited by the idealist, and it's just the dependence of the form of what is beyond the subject on the subject. So the idea here is simple. When we experience the world, we experience it as in space, as in time, causally determined, usually in relation of substance and attributes. These features, which are the forms of what we know, depend on the subject because they depend on our structures of sensibility, structures of understanding as well. So that's the idea of I-dependence. Now, transcendental idealism, unlike empirical idealism, doesn't extend this I-dependence to everything that we know. We don't reduce everything that, we don't say that everything that we know in the world depends on the subject. And this is how empirical idealism can be contrasted with transcendental idealism. Transcendental idealism talks about a reality, the empirical reality of the world. In the case of empirical idealism, everything is dependent on the epistemic subject. Okay. So we have the two puzzles, we have the solution, Kantian solution. We seem to see that this solution depends on this idea of I-dependence, idealism dependence, the dependence of the form of what is known on the subject. Now, Moore next focuses on the distinction between analytic and synthetic armchair knowledge. And he notes that in Kant, we can distinguish between these two kinds of armchair knowledge. And this distinction is related to distinction in Kant between intuitions and concepts. So the subject is given various objects of knowledge by means of intuitions. This is how we get in contact directly with objects, through intuitions. And we get indirectly in contact with objects through concepts. We think of the objects through the concepts, by means of concepts. Now, for Kant, any knowledge, if it has content, must make use of both intuitions and concepts. That is, we need to experience an object, and then what we experience, we make sense of through the concepts. If we just use the concepts, we don't know whether they latch onto anything, whether they apply anything. So we need the intuitions in order to show that objects have this real possibility. And if we don't have concepts, we just have intuitions. We experience something, but we cannot make sense of it. So we need both intuitions and concepts. Okay, now what is distinctive about analytic knowledge is that the exercise of concepts does all the relevant work. So in the case of analytic knowledge, what we state about the subject is already implicit in the subject. So the subject can know that what is being thought is true by appeal to the concepts involved. By contrast, in the case of synthetic armchair knowledge, the subject must appeal to the intuitions involved. And what this would seem to suggest is that no analytic armchair knowledge concerns what is beyond the subject. So if analytic armchair knowledge is knowledge where all the relevant work is done by the concepts that the subject has, then that seems to be knowledge about the conceptual repertoire or the conceptual framework of the subject. It doesn't seem to be relevant for what is beyond the subject. But Moore maintains that we are not forced to conclude this. And this is one of the longer quotations I'm giving from his paper. There is a perfectly good sense of concern, he says, in which the subject's analytic armchair knowledge that all vixens are female, say, concerns vixens, not the subject's concept of a vixen, nor any part of the subject's conceptual repertoire. Indeed, Moore says, my own view is that Kant allows for analytic armchair knowledge that lacks content. That is to say, analytic armchair knowledge in which the concepts involved do not relate to intuitions, and that even knowledge of this kind can, in the relevant sense of concern what is beyond the subject. An example might be the subject's knowledge that things in themselves are things irrespective of how they are given to us, knowledge which concerns things in themselves. So the idea here is that a claim like vixens are female, in principle, we can know it just in virtue of knowledge of the concept of what a vixen is a female fox. So we know that vixens are female. We don't need to look to go in the world and see what vixens are in order to know that it is true that vixens are female. That might seem to suggest that this knowledge doesn't concern the world. But Moore says, well, why not? Why couldn't we say that the claim that vixens are female says something about the world as well? It tells us that those animals there, which are vixens, are female. He thinks that there should be no problem about this. Now, I think there are some problematic claims here. And what I want to do next is to clarify them. And I want to start by a focus on Moore's notion of armchair knowledge and its relation to Kant's distinction between cognition and knowledge. Here there is a knowledge missing. So Wissen is the word for knowledge, usually translated as knowledge. Okay. Okay, now Moore has quite sophisticated understanding and use of knowledge, has quite a sophisticated knowledge of Kant's distinction between knowledge and cognition. So he notes that he uses knowledge for Kant's cognition, but as you will see, he doesn't do this because he's not aware of the importance of the distinction in Kant between cognition and knowledge. He says that he agrees with the translation of Kant's Erkenntnis by cognition. And mainly he does this because he thinks that whatever Kant means by Erkenntnis is not really knowledge. So, for instance, he notes that Kant takes Erkenntnis to be the conscious representation of an object. And indeed, this is a quotation from Kant. This is what Kant also says, that erkenntnis is the conscious representation of an object. Moore paraphrases this loosely as follows: the having of something in mind, or a state that involves the having of something in mind. And he notes that this excludes some knowledge and includes some non-knowledge. So erkenntnis, or cognition, excludes some knowledge and includes some non-knowledge. And this is why, presumably, Moore agrees with the fact that erkenntnis should be translated by cognition rather than by knowledge. Now, Moore doesn't take erkenntnis in a restricted sense. You will see that we can take erkenntnis. I'm going to talk a bit more about what Kant exactly means by erkenntnis, but basically we can have in mind really three notions of erkenntnis. Some of them are more restricted than others. So Moore seems to take erkenntnis, or cognition, in a restricted sense. He seems to include their cognition which requires intuitions and concepts, but he seems also to accept cognition which just includes concepts. Remember again that according to Moore, we can have analytic armchair knowledge, knowledge that where the work is done just by concepts, and which nevertheless is relevant, concerns what is beyond the subject. So it looks like Moore's notion of cognition includes cognition where we have a need for both intuitions and concepts, but also a notion where we just have a need for concepts. So, as I said, he includes their analytic knowledge. So we can distinguish between a more relaxed notion of erkenntnis, which I called EM, M from Moore, which requires not only intuition and concepts, but also accepts that we can have just cognitions based on concepts. And I called EK, a notion of erkenntnis from K. Kant, where you need both intuitions and concepts. And I index that with a K with Kant, because Kant says this is erkenntnis in the more important sense. But again, Kant doesn't exclude also a more extended notion of cognition. Good. Now, the non-knowledge that erkenntnis includes is the conscious representation of an object that contains some error. That's quite important. In Kant, cognition can be false. So if cognition can be false, it means that erkenntnis excludes, or the notion of cognition excludes some knowledge and includes some non-knowledge, namely includes the non-knowledge included is those false cognitions. Usually we take knowledge to be true. So if that's the case, if cognition excludes some knowledge and includes some non-knowledge, then at best these two notions can overlap. That's the best they can do. Now, the reason why Moore wants to talk in terms of knowledge when Kant uses cognition is that he says connects better with his broader concerns. So he's probably interested in knowledge. But his justification for using knowledge is that, and here is a quotation, he says, in all the relevant contexts, the questions that Kant raises about cognition and the answers that he gives are equally questions and answers about knowledge. When he asks, for example, how cognition of a certain kind is possible, the kind of cognition in question is likewise a kind of knowledge. So he thinks that the relevant cases for him are cases where the kind of cognition in question is likewise a kind of knowledge. I think this is very problematic. So I think it's very problematic because in Kant there is in fact a distinction between cognition and knowledge, and there are no cases actually where cognition can be knowledge. These are two distinct notions, and it's not accurate to use knowledge where Kant uses cognition. Simply is not going to work. Okay, so let's look a bit in more detail at what Kant says about cognition and about knowledge. There is a famous passage, the so-called Stufenleiter passage in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant offers a kind of chart of kinds of presentations. So he says, the genus is presentation. I use presentation for Vorstellung. The genus is presentation as such. Representatio, that is a kind of Latin term. Under it falls presentation with consciousness, what he calls perceptio, a perception that refers solely to the subject, namely, as the modification of the subject state is sensation, sensatio. An objective perception is cognition, cognitio. Cognition is either intuition or concept, intuitus vel conceptus. An intuition refers directly to the object and is singular. A concept refers to the object indirectly by means of a characteristic that may be common to several things. So cognition is defined here as objective presentation with consciousness. And objective seems to mean reference. And this is reference, either direct reference or indirect reference to an object. Intuitions create a direct reference to the object. Concepts create an indirect reference to the object. That's why Kant says that intuitions and concepts on their own can be cognitions. Okay. So what we seem to have here is, in the case of cognition as defined by Kant, is just a presentation which refers to an object. And this presentation is something that we are aware of. For instance, Kant says that animals don't have cognitions, but they do have perceptions. So they can perceive, but they don't cognize. So in order to cognize, you need this, what he calls consciousness, which is a presentation of a presentation, kind of an awareness that what I'm doing is to have a presentation of an object, either direct or indirect. Okay, now there are variations in the ways Kant defines erkenntnis, whether we look at the Critique of Pure Reason or at other works. But more important, I think, is we've already seen Kant seems to use erkenntnis or cognition sometimes as a more restricted notion and sometimes as a broader notion. As I mentioned, for Kant, that's a second thing to note. Both intuitions and concepts on their own count as cognitions. Both of them are presentations or ways in which we get acquainted with an object, with something. And they refer directly or indirectly. Intuitions refer directly to objects. Concepts refer indirectly to objects. And they are conscious. They are accompanied by a presentation of a presentation. Finally, the third interesting point is the ways in which concepts and intuitions refer to objects. According to Kant, we refer to objects through concepts in the sense that we think objects through concepts, and we get in contact directly with objects through intuitions. Okay. Okay, so the Kantian notion of cognition, erkenntnis, which Moore seems to have in mind, which I called erkenntnis Moore, is broader than the notion of cognition requiring both intuitions and concepts. I mentioned that already. And this is broader than a notion that Kant sometimes formulates explicitly, which I labeled with K, EK. So Kant says at one point, there are two conditions under which alone there can be cognition of an object. The first condition is intuition. Through it, the object is given, though only as an appearance. The second condition is the concept. Through it, an object is thought that corresponds to this intuition. So here, Kant talks about cognition in a more restricted sense than the sense in which Moore talks about cognition. Okay, now Moore noted already that there is a sense in which erkenntnis is different from knowledge. Namely, we can have false cognitions. But the question is, if we restrict ourselves to even more narrower, to an even narrower notion of cognition, if we restrict ourselves to a notion of true cognitions, is that going to be identical with the notion of knowledge? And the answer is no. And the answer is no, because Kant's discussion of knowledge, conception of knowledge is slightly different. So Kant discusses knowledge in very few passages, mostly in the canon. And what he says in the canon is that knowledge is a case of assent, or also what is a literal translation, a case of holding to be true or considering true, für wahr halten. So knowledge is a case of assent. Cognition is not a case of assent. Moreover, even if we take cognition somehow to be a case of assent, so when we form a presentation of an object, whether in a direct or indirect relation to the object, if we assume that somehow that involves also some form of subjective assent, namely, I'm convinced that my representation, let's say, is a representation of an object, there is still something missing when we compare the notion of cognition with the notion of knowledge. Kant says that in the case of knowledge, we need a justification, a sufficient objective justification for our assent. So when I assent to something and it's knowledge, I need to be certain with regard to what I'm assenting to. And I'm certain on the basis of an objective justification that what I'm assenting to is the case. Now, we don't have anything like this in the case of cognition. In the case of cognition, we just have a representation of an object, and a representation which is accompanied by consciousness, by an awareness. But there is no requirement of an epistemic justification, and that requirement is there for the case of knowledge. So as a form of assent, Wissen or knowledge is distinct from cognition. And it's distinct even from the more restricted notion of cognition mentioned above, namely that where we restrict cognitions just to true cognitions. And restricted cognition is a special case of objective presentation accompanied by consciousness, but it's not a special case of assent. Okay, so you will see that I'm going to rely on this distinction at various points when I'm trying to explain why what Moore takes to be conflicts in Kant are not in fact conflicts. So Moore's justification for the use of knowledge where Kant uses cognition does not seem to hold. And what this seems to suggest is that he might need to reconsider his notion of armchair knowledge, because he says that he uses knowledge where Kant uses cognition, and the justification is that in the relevant cases, Kant's notion of knowledge is the same as his notion of cognition, whereas we've just seen that this is not the case. But take us a second point. Moore's view is that, if you remember, there is a perfectly good sense of concern in which the subject's analytic armchair knowledge that all vixens are female concerns vixens and not the subject's concept of a vixen, nor any part of the subject's conceptual repertoire. And Moore makes this claim as if it's problematic, but it seems to me, if we look from the perspective of this distinction between cognition and knowledge in Kant, and also if we look at it from the perspective of the more and less restricted notions of cognition, we can see that this is perfectly compatible with Kant's framework. It's not so problematic. It's not problematic because as we have seen, and this was the third aspect that I highlighted above, namely the different ways in which intuition and concept refer to objects. Objects are given to intuitions and are thought through concepts. Kant says that intuitions are singular, refer to objects directly, whereas concepts are general and refer to objects indirectly. They refer to objects through certain features. So concepts are a set of features. Those features are shared by more objects. So when I refer to an object through one of those features, I don't actually refer just to one object. I refer through that feature to a group of objects, and only indirectly also to a particular object. That is quite important. It will be quite important later on. So this also explains why concepts are general. They just don't, and not singular. They don't refer just to one object, they refer to a group. So we can see that analytic armchair knowledge can concern objects, and indeed, they concern them in a different way than the type of cognition or erkenntnis requiring both concepts and intuitions. Analytic armchair knowledge can concern objects, despite the fact that all the work is done by concepts, because as we could see, according to the Kantian framework itself, concepts do refer to objects. So it's nothing unusual to say that analytic armchair knowledge concerns something beyond the subject. It's just that it does so indirectly. Okay, now with these terminological clarifications in place, we can look further at Moore's argument. We move to the more problematic accusations, namely the accusation of the incoherence of transcendental idealism, and he points also to some other conflicts and contradictions in Kant. Okay, now Moore thinks that Kant holds that transcendental idealism is needed to solve the puzzle with regard to synthetic armchair knowledge, but only with respect to synthetic armchair knowledge. Okay, so you are familiar, more or less familiar with Kant's idea that in order to explain how it is possible to have synthetic a priori knowledge, Kant says that we need pure intuitions, which enable a justification of the synthetic relation between concepts. Otherwise, we connect in a synthetic way concepts only through experience. So to have a priori synthetic connection between concepts, we need pure intuitions. once we introduce pure intuitions, we have transcendental idealism. So what Moore says is that for Kant, transcendental idealism is needed for synthetic armchair knowledge. But his question is, could we not use it also for analytic armchair knowledge? In principle, we have no need for transcendental idealism in order to justify analytic armchair knowledge, because we can explain analytic knowledge simply by referring to the fact that the predicate in the case of a claim is contained in the subject. So when I say vixens are female, I know it's true in virtue of the fact that when I say vixens, I already presuppose the notion of female there. But that's not Moore's point. Moore's question is, despite the fact that there is no need to invoke transcendental idealism, would Kant be happy with this? And this is how Moore imagines the situation. He asks us to imagine a philosopher who thinks that the form of what is beyond the subject, which depends on the subject, as you remember, is not confined to the feature Kant asserts, to the spatial temporal conditions, to causality, to the categories, but it extends to all those of its essential features that are in any way conceptual, such as the feature of being if a vixen female. Moreover, this philosopher thinks that the contingency of this dependence of the form on the subject belongs equally to the subject's general conceptualization of things. So what Moore says is, imagine a philosopher who says, part of our a priori structure of mind is given by the elements that are introduced by Kant, pure intuitions, categories, ideas. But what if we want to extend that and to introduce all essential features which are conceptual? Like in the case of, we know that in the case of vixens, it is essential for vixens to be female. What if we take that essential property to be part of this a priori structure of the mind? Would Kant then be happy to use transcendental idealism as a solution to the problem, to the puzzle of armchair knowledge in general, whether analytic or synthetic? And Moore thinks that Kant would have something against this. And this is because, on Moore's account, Kant thinks a subject can have thoughts concerning things in themselves. For instance, as suggested above by Moore, some analytic armchair knowledge, or in its absence, the thought that we are free. And if we think that the subject's conceptualization contributes as much to that contingency of the dependence of the form on the subject, as the subject's spatial temporal intuitions, then the subject's thinking, just like the subject's intuiting, is always of appearances, cannot be of things in themselves. Okay, so Moore says, well, Kant must have something against this idea of extending the structure of the mind, because Kant says that in virtue of the fact that pure intuitions are part of the structure of the mind, what we intuit are appearances. If we include as well all conceptuality, then what we are going to think of will only be appearances. But that's a problem for Kant, Moore says, because Kant wants us to be able to think of things in themselves, and then we would no longer be able to do that. Now, I think what Moore here does is quite problematic. So let's stick for a moment to Kant's model of the mind, okay? And this includes, among its a priori structures, as you know, pure intuitions, categories, and ideas, but no other concepts. And on this model, Kant claims that we can think of things in themselves. But of course, Kant doesn't believe that we can think of things in themselves specifically with the help of empirical concepts like the concept of vixens, right? He thinks we can think of things in themselves, whatever we want, as long as we are not contradicting ourselves, and as long as we are aware that what we are thinking about through a concept might have no object corresponding to it. So if we are extending the a priori structure of the mind to include essential features that are conceptual, like being female when vixen, that's not going to make at all a difference to our capacity to have thoughts concerning things in themselves, at least as this is understood by Kant. So Moore points here, I don't think functions. The reason why Kant has something against using transcendental idealism to solve the puzzle of analytic armchair knowledge is not to do with the fact that we can we should be able to think of things in themselves. Okay, but Moore says, well, the question would still be whether Kant would be justified in rejecting this extended model and the associated solution. So maybe Kant is uneasy about it, but would he be justified in being uneasy about it? And Moore thinks that the answer to this question depends on the following question. Again, a quotation. When Kant argues from the existence of armchair knowledge concerning what is beyond the subject to the truth of transcendental idealism, at what point in his argument does he make crucial appeal to the fact that the armchair knowledge is synthetic, and relatedly, what in his own terms would preclude someone's extending the argument to armchair knowledge that is analytic? So what Moore wants to do next is to say if Kant has anything against this idea of using transcendental idealism to solve the puzzle of analytic armchair knowledge, that this might be because there is something crucial about synthetic armchair knowledge which requires transcendental idealism and which is not required in the case of analytic armchair knowledge. Okay. Can I double check how am I doing about time? How long do I?
Well, actually, it's time to finish, but you can
time to finish. Okay.
5 minutes, 5 more minutes if you need.
Let me try to just instead of going through my paper, let me just try to get to the most important points. Yes. Good. So here is the crucial problem identified by Moore. Moore thinks that there is something problematic in Kant's attempt to justify knowledge of what is necessary as necessary through transcendental idealism. And this is for the following reason. So when we are experiencing the world, we see the world as being in space, we see the world as being in time, and we see the world as having certain features. For instance, it might seem to us that certain effects are produced by certain causes. But we don't know whether these are necessary features of the world. And the only way to know that these are necessary features of the world is to stand back and to reflect on our capacities. And then we might realize, that is, reflect also on our armchair knowledge. And that is the knowledge we already have in ourselves without exploring the world. and to realize that we already have in ourselves certain structures of the mind, like the pure intuitions, space and time, or the idea of causation. Now, what Moore says is that Kant can only explain our knowledge of what is necessary in this way. Namely, we stand back from our own standpoint, from our own point of view, and we look at our point of view and we say we are structured by pure intuition, space and time, by causation, substance, and other categories. And what this implies is that when we experience the world, we are going to experience the world necessarily as in space and time, causally determined in relations of substance and attribute, and so on and so forth. Now, what Moore says, however, is that something like the following happens. When we stand back from our standpoint, right, we realize that what the knowledge we have is a particular knowledge, it's a contingent knowledge, the knowledge given by a specific point of view, and that there are also other points of view in principle. So this is what he calls the contingency, which grounds the necessity of our knowledge. Now, the problem, Moore says, is that when we stand back from this epistemic position, we don't actually move to another epistemic position, but we move to a kind of fictional, and that links quite nicely also with Sebastian's presentation, fictional perspective, a perspective of no point of view, the perspective of things in themselves, okay? Because Kant says that things in themselves are things as they are, independently from the structures of our mind. So if we stand back from that structure of the mind, we move into a perspective where there is no point of view, because it's an absolute perspective. It's the perspective of the things in themselves. Okay. But then Moore says, if for us to account for knowledge, to solve the puzzle of armchair knowledge and to solve the puzzle of necessary knowledge, we need to stand back from our standpoint, then when we are going to formulate certain conclusions of our investigation, like the fact that there is synthetic a priori knowledge, then we formulate those from that strange perspective of things in themselves. And what this means is that we have knowledge of things in themselves, and we even have synthetic knowledge of things in themselves. The fact that there is synthetic a priori knowledge, Moore says, is a synthetic claim. It's not empirical, so it must be a priori. And because it's formulated from this strange perspective, it must be knowledge of things in themselves. And that's precisely something that Kant denies. He rejects. Okay. Now, that's Moore's criticism. What I'm doing in order to clarify why Kant is not self-undermining, is there is no contradiction there, are two things. First of all, I want to clarify the fact that when Kant says something like there is synthetic a priori cognition, what he says is nothing about things in themselves. If I stand back from my intuitions and talk about vixens, according to Moore's model, I should be talking about things in themselves. But that's of course absurd, because according to Kant, whatever we can say about things in themselves is not going to distinguish between groups of things in themselves, vixens and other beings. So if I am to think of things in themselves, I can only think of them through the notion of things in themselves, not through the notion of vixen or through the notion of synthetic a priori cognition. The second thing I want to say is that Kant doesn't deny that we have knowledge of things in themselves. What Kant denies is that we have theoretical cognition of things in themselves, and also that whatever knowledge we have of things in themselves is going to be a very general knowledge which doesn't identify anything in particular about those things in themselves. So Kant, of course, might say that, and he says it at one point, it's absurd to assume that there are appearances without something that appears. So to assume that there are phenomena or appearances without things in themselves. And he's often taken to mean by this that it's absurd to say that there are no things in themselves, and then hence to claim that things in themselves exist, which is a synthetic claim about things in themselves. Now, Kant has no problem to talk about knowledge of things in themselves. But only when we talk about things in themselves in general. Kant's claim is that we cannot have knowledge of particular things in themselves. And that's because we have no intuitions of things in themselves. So again, that would also clarify why there isn't a contradiction or a self-undermining commitment in Kant's position. Very good. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Very rich and very ambitious paper and very nice presentation. Now the floor is open for the questions. There are too much to think about.
Yes, take your time, please, and please use the chat as well if you want.
Yeah. And if maybe in the meantime I can ask a question about the last point you made about the knowledge about things in themselves, which is very controversial claim. And I would usually, I mean, generally, I would think, because I haven't really studied this topic specifically, I would think that Kant denies any knowledge of things in themselves. And the reason is because I usually think of knowledge, which you didn't mention here, but knowledge as a systematized version of cognitions, right? We have cognitions first with intuitions and concepts come together, we have cognitions, and then with the application of or the use of ideas of reason, which regulate and systematize cognitions, we then have knowledge. And so knowledge is not, for me, is not completely something different from cognition, but just builds on cognitions. And so I would then, in my position, then if you lack cognition of something, you would lack knowledge of that thing as well. Because you can only have cognitions of objects of experience, and therefore you can only have knowledge of appearances. But the reason I would want to say that Kant would have motivation at least to deny the knowledge of things in themselves is because of this very famous passage where he says, I denied knowledge in order to leave room for faith, right? So it seems like he does want to say that, you know, I'm going to say that God, immortality, soul, etc., these are not the things that we can have knowledge simply because they are objects of faith. So how would you respond to that passage particularly? How should we interpret that passage then?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Why? Because God, freedom, and immortality of the soul, these are specific things in themselves. And what Kant wants to deny is precisely, as you say, knowledge of specific things in themselves. We cannot have knowledge of these specific things in themselves because for us, knowledge of specific objects can only be given by intuition. But we cannot intuit things in themselves. So that's why Kant, of course, denies knowledge of specific things in themselves, and hence also knowledge of God, immortality of the soul, and freedom. or the world as a whole, or yeah. Now, when it comes to, however, to things in themselves in general, I don't think Kant can deny the possibility of knowledge of that, because what is this knowledge? What does he take knowledge to be? Well, he thinks that, as mentioned, knowledge is a form of assent, a way in which we approve, we assent to something, usually to a claim, and in the case of knowledge, we need sufficient subjective and objective grounds, and those subjective and objective grounds need not be given by intuition, need not be given by direct contact with a particular object. They can be also given by our conceptual resources. So in that respect, for instance, it would be strange to deny the fact that when Kant says things in themselves are things as they are independently from our experience of them, it would be difficult to deny that this, which is an analytic claim, that we don't have knowledge of that, because we have a justification for it, namely the predicate is already included in the subject. So our assent can be made with certainty, and that's the sign of knowledge. I mean, it's interesting, Kant says that even for cognition, there are two ways in which we can, he says that for cognition, is not sufficient to, okay, so here is the distinction he draws. He draws the distinction between thinking of things in themselves and cognizing things in themselves. And he says that we can think whatever we want about things in themselves as long as we are logically consistent. So all is needed for things in themselves in order for us to be able to think of them is that they are logically possible. But in order for us to cognize things in themselves, we need them to be really possible. We need them to have this reality. And he thinks that there are two sources for this reality. One is, of course, given by intuition, by experience. And we get that with phenomena when we learn about the world. We don't have that for things in themselves. But the second source is given by reason, he says. And then he says that we can get to the real possibility of things in themselves through reason, but only in the practical domain. So Kant asserts that there is practical cognition of specific things in themselves. All he denies is knowledge of specific things in themselves, but he doesn't deny knowledge of things in themselves in general.
Just a follow-up, but aren't we then misusing the a priori concepts of particular and general, that is, the a priori concepts of the understanding, by applying them to things in themselves? Because when you distinguish things in themselves, can be either specific things in themselves or general things in themselves, or even when you use the concept of existence, they exist or they don't exist. I mean, even while we are talking about them, obviously we are thinking about them either in specific or in general form, particular or, you know, general, or as existing or non-existing, but this would be just the way we think, right? And just like, for example, dogmatist philosophers would think of God differently. One would describe God as that greater than which cannot be taught. Another would describe God and think of God as the most perfect being with the all perfections, and so on and so forth. But these definitions and the way we think change. These are considered to be analytic claims, but they change from person to person. And even with this analytic claims about the things in nature, right? So for example, we used to describe electron as the smallest particle with the negative charge, but now we figured that there are smaller particles with the negative charge, quarks, and now we don't describe electron the way that is. So that analytic truth that was once we were certain of is not true anymore. So we changed that analytic truth. And so maybe it became two questions, right? So the one is about our justification of these kind of analytic truths. It seems Kant wouldn't want to say that they are knowledge, because he precisely saw that is the problem in the dogmatist, that the reason why metaphysics became a battlefield of ideas, everyone had their own analytic truths and claimed that this is the certain truth. And the second one, and then by saying that, you know, this is the part of things in themselves that we know, and this is not the ones that we know, we are already misusing, it seems, the a priori concepts of the understanding.
Well, I guess, I mean, I think that's very interesting again, but I think there are two questions here. One question is it possible for us to first to use these concepts which seem to belong to understanding to make sense of the things in themselves? Is that not self-undermining? And I guess Kant's reply here would be to say, well, we are doing this only in the same way in which we are saying that things in themselves are not spatial-temporal, or things in themselves are not causally determined. In the same way, we are going to say things in themselves, we are not going to apply to them notions like being specific or being general. But what you do when you try to what you do when you try to claim that knowledge of God, for instance, is precisely to attribute some specific properties. So Kant would say, we precisely by denying the application of these notions of the understanding to things in themselves, we are able to solve this problem of specific knowledge about things in themselves. Now, concerning analytic knowledge, this is very interesting. I mean, I think what Kant would say about the, or what Kant might say about the debates between dogmatists in metaphysics is that if these dogmatists realized that what they were doing was simply to put forward analytic knowledge of things in themselves, then the battlefield of metaphysics would have acquired peace very quickly, because they would have realized that all they needed to do was to agree on the conventions to use when they talk about a specific entity. So, for instance, to give you the example, to refer back to your example of the atoms. So let's say atoms in ancient Greek philosophy were those particles which could no longer be divided. Now we started to identify smaller particles, so we can no longer define atoms in this way. But what Kant would say is, yes, we have a different notion of atom. And that notion which they had is still in place. And the knowledge, analytic knowledge they had, it's still valid, it's still necessary. Now, of course, we realize now that we have a different notion of an atom, and different rules for the use of that notion of an atom. So when there are disagreements, it's just a matter of realizing that other conventions for the use of the word atom are used today. So it's no longer so much a metaphysical debate, it's a debate between which rules, linguistic rules, are enforced now. And that would take care of any metaphysical debates. So that knowledge is still valid. What Greeks said is still the case. It's still necessary. So again, that wouldn't be very problematic as far as Kant would be concerned, I think.
I see. Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me see. I don't want to monopolize the Q&A. There are other questions. Yes, Özlem Hocam.
Thank you, Sorin, for your very informative talk. I learned too much, indeed. But I just would like to ask you that if we can make inferences, some inferences from Kantian armchair or armchair knowledge in favor of practical or political philosophy, especially the political meaning of this.
Sorry, Özlem, by mistake, I unmuted you. Sorry. I was hoping to lower your hand. Sorry. Could you repeat that?
Okay. But I will repeat. Okay, just I would like to ask you, can we make some inferences from Kantian armchair knowledge in favor of political philosophy, or we can take account its political meanings? I also would like to Sebastian this question, the same question, especially on representative thinking and some appropriation of Kantian thoughts to contemporary philosophy, such as Arendtian thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you like to go first, Sebastian, or is it okay to go first? If I go first.
I mean, I think you should go first because I think this is your area of expertise, and I'm not particularly sure I have that much to say. I will maybe say something about it, but I need to think about it a little bit first.
Well, I think there are many implications for. I think there are many implications for the practical philosophy, especially for the Kantian practical philosophy. I mean, as mentioned, as we discussed in relation to the previous questions, one thing Kant was trying to do when he was looking at in the critique of pure reason at all these issues concerning cognition and knowledge and metaphysics was precisely an attempt to understand what the source of the various debates was, but also how we can respond to certain metaphysical positions which seem to have some very serious practical implications. So how is it possible, for instance, to make sense of a world, of our world as determined by natural laws, but at the same time as of ourselves as free individuals? Even if we were to make sense of ourselves as free individuals, that is, as individuals free to pursue certain goals we have, that, according to Kant, would have gone against the grain of his moral philosophy. because in his moral philosophy, Kant thought that we could, well, he assumed that we would be free in the sense not only of being free to realize or to pursue certain goals which are already given to us, but also that we are free to evaluate our goals and to see whether they are moral or not. And one implication of what Kant does here is to say it is possible for us to make sense of these claims, of the claim that we are free, and also of the claim that we live in a world which is causally determined, precisely by limiting our pretensions or our ambitions with regard to what we can know. Now imagine that this Kantian system turns out to be self-undermining and contradictory. Then of course some of the solutions Kant thought he would find to these problems would as well be challenged. So his idea that he's able to show that we are free and then that there is a sense in which we can talk about the moral law. He talks about the moral law as about us as being able to follow the moral law. All these claims would be undermined as well. So this is what I take to be the main implications. Those will have also further political implications. Again, Kant takes, for instance, good politicians to be those politicians which formulate an appropriate system of law. And an appropriate system of law is a system where norms guide the individuals, whether those individuals want to follow the norms because they think they are right or just because they want to escape punishment. Nevertheless, Kant thinks it's absolutely essential for citizens to be able to follow the norms because they think they are the right norms. And that's because Kant thinks that individuals are free, so they are able to do that. So again, there are implications also for political philosophy there too. I think there are also countless of other implications to do with the link between politics and religion, because through his first critique, Kant also makes space for religion, and also makes space for religion in a very interesting way. Some argue that he makes space for religion which not for a particular religion, but for a pluralism of religions. And that's of course very important in societies where there are various groups, where there is religious pluralism. So I think there are countless implications. There was one question in the an earlier question in the chat box about Kant's categorical imperative and the fact that sometimes it's considered to be bad because here it is said you basically sacrifice yourself for someone instead of so for instance, this idea that what we are doing when we are following the moral law is that we are supposed to for instance, there are certain moral requirements, the requirement that we don't lie even when it's in our interest. And the question is, does this mean that, I think this was the question in the chat, does this suggest that we don't count so much, because we basically are enjoined by Kant's moral philosophy to forget about our interests and do what is right. Does this mean that we are not valuable sufficiently so that we pursue our own interests? So it says here, not lying is good, but sacrificing yourself for someone instead of your own perspective. What yourself find ethical, you shift your mind to what is good or bad for society. Well, I guess the idea is that what Kant tells us to bracket when we are moral are indeed personal interests, but he thinks that those are not the interests which give us value. What gives us value is the fact that we are free, rational beings, not the fact that we may have this interest, this particular interest or the other. Particular interests are not giving us value. What gives us value is the fact that we are rational beings who precisely can separate ourselves from that. There was, I think, another question. Can we know objects that don't exist in real world, such as Pegasus? I can claim that I have the knowledge of horse and wing, but Pegasus. Okay, yes. Well, I think this is not so much a problem for Kant, but I mean, look, this paper, and that's an invitation as well. This paper I'm arguing against is the Rousseau annual lecture that Adrian Moore is going to give at Keele in next week. Join the conference if you want. It's free, and you have access to various papers, including this one. In this paper, Moore is providing, he has quite ambitious aims in that paper. He wants to provide an account of knowledge of what is necessary as necessary, independently from transcendental idealism. He puts forward an alternative account, which is Wittgensteinian, but he formulates it also in a Spinozian guise. Basically, the model is the extended model of the mind which I mentioned before, which starts from the analytic armchair knowledge. So basically what Moore says is, forget about pure intuitions, forget that we have anything like that, let's just reject them, and let's just say that our mind is just has a structure which consists of those essential features which are conceptual. And it seems to me, once you do that, you have the worries you mentioned. For instance, in a paper, in a footnote in his paper, Moore says we can have analytic knowledge of mermaids, right? We can make certain claims about mermaids. Now, mermaids, we would say, Kant would say, are not really possible, don't have this, they are logically possible, but they are not really possible. The question is whether with this new Wittgensteinian or Spinozian account of the mind that is proposed by Moore, we don't end up with problems like the problems between like the problem of accounting for what is really possible as opposed to what is merely logically possible. It seems to me in Kant, the answer is simple. Look, we have experience. On the basis of experience, we can determine what is empirically real. And this is how we know that mermaids are not empirically real. Whereas, I don't know, vixens are. But that is given to us by intuition. If we abandon intuition, I'm not sure whether we would be able to make sense of such fundamental distinctions like the one mentioned here in the chat box.
Thank you. And maybe Sebastian has a response to Özlem's question about the political implications of.
I think I'm going to just like do it in guise of sort of just like a short comment on the slight ambiguity there regarding armchair knowledge in general. So, and there is that, and I mean, it's probably why I had a bit of a hard time following everything that Sorin was going through. But I think there's a sort of ambiguity when we talk about armchair knowledge, where I mean, most of the time when I think of the phrase, I'm thinking of questions of theoretical philosophy, where I actually think Kant is probably much more destructive in saying that, well, actually we have very little or no armchair knowledge whatsoever, because laying out meanings of concepts and so on in some sense have to have some grounding experience to account for how we acquired those concepts in the first place, apart from, well, the categories and the ideas. But even then, just the armchair knowledge is in explaining how these have direct reference to experience. But then when we get to political matters, we can work with a number of different assumptions that license us to make some very, very powerful assumptions about which we can say that they're knowledge. But it's sort of different, because they're knowledge about what's in some sense morally or politically required of us in order to form certain sorts of institutions, relationships, communities, and how one should act. That is, how one should use one's reason to guide the choices that we make in life. And I think that's it's quite different, because so now we've gotten into a situation where we actually have a lot of armchair knowledge, because Kant is much more prepared to talk about things themselves once we've entered the practical context. So I think that there's a lot to draw on, but I think it's again more in line with what Sorin already mentioned about certain practical implications regarding treatment of individuals and rights, and certain sorts of religious pluralism and tolerance, and those sorts of things. And it's a very, very minimal kind of framework, but again quite powerful, because it's sort of because he's trying to lay something that's supposed to be a baseline for any sort of society that wants to make claims to justice or being good or those sorts of things. But I'm not particularly sure what the practical value of is of calling it the armchair knowledge, just because it's sort of like it's made in the armchair, because in the end we're only going to see what the value of it is in the way that we figure out how one can practically implement those sorts of principles. So discovering those principles is one thing, figuring, and I'm just thinking about the doctrine of right here, because, well, of course, he's starting with certain very strong a priori assumptions, but he also has to make certain empirical assumptions about what sorts of beings we are, so that we can see how the metaphysical principles actually apply. And I think it is quite important that we know that human beings are mortal, that we have bodies that become ill, that have certain sorts of vulnerabilities, and that we live on a planet with sort of limited space, and that just like that all of these sorts of conditions start to apply even while we make these sorts of strong assumptions from the armchair. So yeah, I think Kant is a bit more destructive probably than Sorin is as far as accounting for the possibility of armchair knowledge, but leave that for another conversation.
Thank you. And I'd like to encourage students to raise their questions to Sorin. It doesn't have to be maybe on this particular presentation about his other work or about maybe Kant's political philosophy, his ethics, its time value, have the chance. I think it's a good opportunity. But maybe you're a bit shy. Well,
there was a clarification actually quite interesting in the chat box, again related to the initial question about the categorical imperative, and the student added that consequentialists might have a point. And I think this is I'm just going to mention something which I always find interesting. There is sometimes the perception that Kant's moral philosophy is not concerned with the consequences of actions, and there is a certain sense in which we can understand consequences in which this is correct, but there is a different sense in which this is certainly not correct. So when Kant says, well, or when there is this claim that Kant's moral philosophy is not consequentialist, the reference is usually to those moral theories which take the morality of action to be given by the consequences of the action. But what it means, what such consequentialist theories mean by consequences is not the effects an action might have, but rather effects, or rather perhaps effects, yes, but in a particular sense, not in the physical sense in which in physics we talk about cause and effect, but in the sense in which utilitarians were talking about consequences, about the utility of the action, the extent to which an action tends to increase happiness or not. And then, of course, instead of happiness, we can take into consideration other aspects, because there are various consequentialist theories. Now, Kant's moral philosophy is very much concerned with consequences, if by consequences we mean understanding what are the effects of our actions as far as the physical world is concerned. So, for instance, it's very important for Kant if my action is going to lead to the fact that a human being will die or will be harmed, or these are important concerns. What is not important is whether a particular action is going to be, or is going to make me happy or not. So there are certain consequences of the actions. Without knowing them, we wouldn't be able to understand what actions we are concerned with. And that's not the consequences Kant ignores. The consequences Kant ignores is the effect of the action for my specific particular interests, whether it's going to please me or displease me, whether it's going to make me happy or not. Those are considerations or consequences that Kant would bracket, but not every consideration of the effect of the action, because we cannot talk about an action, we cannot know what kind of action we are performing without knowing also what are some of the likely consequences of what we are doing. Okay, does this make sense? So yeah, okay, so yes, consequentialists, you can say, have a point, but at the same time we are also quite clear that there are problematic implications of this consequentialist theories, and that's what. Oh, okay, thanks. I can see in the box that the student, I think he said the student was a first-year student, was happy with that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. And that's That's a very important point that you just clarified, because of the caricaturized Kant just ignores the consequences, and then you refined it very nicely. So if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Sorin once again for his illuminating and very comprehensive, that was the word I was looking for, not the ambitious, comprehensive paper and presentation. It was a pleasure to have you both, Sorin and Sebastian, here. And I would like to thank also the Keele University Philosophy Department and everyone who had a role in the organization of this event.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for
Thanks so much.
both of you and all the participants. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.